Assalamu alaikum. Bismillah. Alhamdulillah. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulina Muhammadin wa alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Welcome to everybody to this workshop entitled by Post-Human Age, which is deliberating on the science, technology, and the future of the humanity. And we are now opening the second session of this workshop, which is entitled by the Posthumanism and the Transcendetal. In this session, there are two dear speakers, and the first is going to introduce his paper as Mr. Auwais Rafudeen by the title Cultivating the Worshipful Self in an Algorithmic Age, Reflections on an Asadian Conclusion. Mr. Auwais, he is an associate professor in Department of Religious Studies and Arabic, University of South Africa, where he lectures in Islamic Studies and Arabic. He has published on various aspects of Islam in South Africa, as well as on the work of Talal Asad. Having obtained his PhD in religious studies, he also has an abiding interest in theories and theories of religion and in the association notion of modernity. In this presentation, he's going to deal with the tension between two languages. The language was inaugurated by the modernity, which bases on the calculation and abstraction, which endangered the previous notion of the language, which was developed by the traditional style. That's why he will deal with this tension between two languages. And while he's dealing this tension, he tried to find, is there any opportunity to the religiosity in the future situations, even though logically it is impossible, but he says that this new era, this new situation will be endanger the conditions of cultivating religiosity. And here is, please, Mr. Auwais Rafudeen. Okay, you are introducing your presentation. You're welcome.
Thank you very much, Professor Bilal. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. And I'm going to share my screen. I hope this works. Can you see my screen? Do you see my screen yet? No. Okay, let me do that now. Is it okay now? Can you see my screen?
No, excuse me. No, you did not share yet.
Not yet. Okay. If you could just give me a minute. Okay, I'm pressing the share option, and I wonder what's happening here.
At the bottom of the page, you can see the share screen.
Yes, I'm clicking that, and it says
on green with a green, yeah.
Yeah, no, I did that, and okay, let me do that. Okay, sorry, I think I've got it now, and let's go on to that. Is that okay now?
No, it is okay now. Thank you.
Okay, so we're looking at the cultivating the worshipful self in an algorithmic age, reflections on an Asadian conclusion, and this is based on the work of some reflections on the work of Talal Asad. So, just okay. So, just for, I'm sure many of you know Talal Asad, but he's of course a prominent anthropologist and major theorist of religion. And he's known for particularly two works, Genealogies of Religion, 1993, and Formations of the Secular. He's the son of Muhammad Asad, the very famous Austrian convert to Islam. But very interestingly, he's more profoundly influenced by his mother, Munira al-Shammari. The embodied religion of his mother really got him to think. And another great influence, and that also led him to this embodiment, was Wittgenstein. Was another big influence on his thinking, especially the later Wittgenstein. So I just find that quite fascinating, because his father is, of course, so well known, but his Bedouin mother was the one who's influenced his thinking. So all these great books are really down to his Bedouin mother. Although he's written a whole lot, I want to focus particularly on this book here, Secular Translations. And this was his latest book. And the ideas on posthumanism, he alludes to in the conclusion to this book. But really, it's a build-up. Those ideas in the conclusion are really a build-up to that conclusion. So a lot of this presentation will focus on that build-up. Now, his focus, all the time, in fact, since the 1980s, late 1980s, he really wanted to strive to find out what is this reality we're living in. What is the what is the air that we breathe, so to speak? How do we define the age, make sense of our present historical moment? And that really was the kind of impetus behind a lot of his writing. And what he has, his conclusion basically is, and this is after a very thorough genealogical exploration of modernity and the foundations of our contemporary world, was that we live in an age of abstraction, that modernity, and especially since the 17th century, inaugurated the age of abstraction. There was a mathematical approach to reality. We'll discuss some of the details there, but this led to a way that saw reality as almost an experiment. Abstraction, abstracts, number one, thought from feeling, leaving life, reality, to be read as signs and numbers. Therefore, once it's read not as forms of life, as as living, breathing kind of components of things that are fused with both thought and feeling. If thought is separated from feeling, then reality can be read as signs and numbers, and they can be manipulated, of course, for various purposes. And our current algorithmic reality is basically an acceleration of that mathematical impulse, of that impulse towards abstraction inaugurated by modernity. And Asad quotes Max Weber, very famously, where Max Weber, in talking about secularization, and of course, abstraction is intertwined with secularization, says that secularization inaugurated a calculable world. In other words, everything now can potentially be known. And in Weber's very famous phrase, the world is now disenchanted. So that's just where Asad is coming from. But to look at abstraction, to understand abstraction, we've got to understand what went, in a sense, before abstraction. It's still with us, but what was the dominant reality before? What was the dominant pre-modern reality? And that reality was what he calls embodiment. And embodiment is where thought and feeling are fused in one. And the best way to maybe explain this is to maybe take the Quran reading or Quranic recitation as an example. So what happens in Quranic recitation, it takes place repeatedly, it takes place, as a ritual, of course. And the primary purpose of reading the Quran is, of course, to develop the virtues both described in the Quran, but also, the very act of reading. And this is a very important component of his thought, because this fuses the thought and the feeling. The very act of reading is, one where one ought to be in a devout state, where one is, reading in order to cultivate a particular disposition towards, transcendent reality. So for devout Muslims, Quranic meanings are not mechanically determined by logical and lexical criteria, or even simply by social context. This is quoting Asad. Piety as awe of God, birru taqwa, is not merely a divine injunction. It is regarded as a necessary presupposition for understanding the meanings of the Quran. So here again, thought cannot be separated from feeling. We have to have the proper dispositions in order to truly understand the meaning of the Quran. In other words, sit properly before God. So the Quran, in this sense, can never be translated as a sign, just as a sign or a number. It has to be, translated into one's body. One has to obviously cultivate thoughts and the feeling of reverence to have to cultivate the virtuous self. So one does not seek to assert the self, unlike modernity, and we'll come now again to abstraction. Here in this kind of cultivation, pre-modern cultivation, as in Islam, one does not seek to assert the self, what might be called, the lower self, the nafs, in the face of this transcendent reality, but one seeks to negate the self. Okay, and of course develop, in a sense, a higher self. So, and the striving to negate the lower self and build the virtuous one is done within a tradition. In other words, a shared way of life that is typically supported by parents, teachers, shuyukh, friends, and so on. In other words, the willingness to obey is cultivated. One doesn't resist tradition. One seeks one is willing to obey tradition. Of course, not blind obedience, but, a learned obedience. And just additionally, because the Quran cannot be translated verbally, in other words, just as another sign, it has to be translated into the body. It cannot be co-opted by the state or ecclesiastical authority. Now, this contrasts, this pre-modern view of embodiment contrasts quite a bit with abstraction. And what is abstraction? Well, number one, it's the separation of thought from feeling. Of course, that itself, this presumed separation from thought and feeling is itself a type of embodiment, because it creates new desires, new attitudes, new feelings, new aspirations. In other words, it develops the secular self. The secular self presumes to separate thought from feeling, but you can never really do so, because the two are in reality fused. In other words, secularism, or the secular is a theology, and that has to be, of course, recognized as such. It develops its own type of self. One of the principles in this theology is that it asserts the self as autonomous. Very importantly, one of the defining features of the secular is that it actively resists tradition, unlike, of course, embodiment, which is willing to submit to that tradition. Of course, it's not, again, if one looks at it deeply, as I says, it's not a real resistance, because one still gives allegiance to the state. The secular citizen still gives allegiance to the state. And of course, also gives allegiance to the market. It's quite fascinating how he employs psychoanalysis. Okay, it doesn't do it in too much detail, but our own the pervasiveness of capitalism and the market, of course, works on our desires. We're not truly autonomous, although we think we are in this secular environment. So freed of authority, the social world can now be, this is from the secular perspective, because it's not beholden to authority, we can map and manipulate the social world for various purposes. And in this re-engineering of the social world, the calculation plays a central role, especially in order to deal with uncertainty and to strive to make this reality, and the state leads in this process. It strives to kind of contain reality and make it in its own image. And abstraction, of course, as the word indicates, abstracts elements then from other forms of life and seeks to define it in its own terms, rather than learn from those other forms of life. So in this, this reality of abstraction inaugurated by modernity, by secularism, we find, again, reading life as signs, reading life as numbers. So, for example, even in the headscarf debate, in France, the famous one in 2004, those who were against the headscarf read it as a sign of, Islamic fundamentalism. Yeah, but even those who supported it read it as a sign of identity. But Asad says, when you really look at it, the real reason many women wore it was because they were inhabiting a certain form of life, of course, trying to get closer to God through, one of wearing the headscarf. So that kind of thing was totally neglected in a secular approach to the issue, in an abstracted approach to the issue. So, when we look at the separation of thought from feeling, or this presumed separation of thought from feeling that informs secularity, it implies that the message, that means a statement or an action alone, can become the focus, not the feeling associated with the action, such as, for example, we saw in the Quran that evidence or associated with reading the Quran. So this impetus in modernity makes it difficult to learn from historically pre-modern modes of life. In other words, you can't truly engage and learn from other forms of life, because you've already reduced their form of life to a text to be read, to science to be read. And in science, all feeling is, of course, put on the back burner, and all things are subject to experiment and measure. Calculative rationality, this abstraction from forms of life, is the distinctive feature of modernity. And just to quickly then contrast embodiment versus abstraction, embodiment is predicated on the materiality of the natural, sensible body. The purpose of worship is to change bodily dispositions, to make one, attain those feelings of reverence and awe and so on, to what the tradition sees as virtuous behavior. So you change bodily dispositions to virtuous behavior. Abstraction erodes this principle in two ways. It's by separating thought from feeling. The message is separated from the medium. So we all think of things in terms of science, in terms of numbers. This is the way the secular actually shapes us. So even though we might, be religious or seek religion, we are pulled in two ways, by the market and the state on the one hand, and by our, pre-modern religious sensibilities on the other. So abstraction erodes that pre-modern sensibility by putting in competition with those other two factors. And secondly, with the onset of posthumanism, this process is accelerated as all things become rendered as statements, thoughts, information. and further divorced from this materiality, from the natural body. So just what are the implications here for post-humanism? For us, developments in artificial intelligence and genetic engineering will more likely entrench the control of the state, the control of the secular. The state basically, is founded on the principle of abstraction. So pointing to the possible consequence of brain-machine interface technology, Asad believes natural life will be treated as a source of information. We're talking about Elon Musk and Neuralink, and the possibilities there that people sometimes are excited about. To be fed via mathematical science into robots. Human life, in other words, will simply be the fodder for a post-human reality. And the whole notion of an embodied life is now overtaken by one based on abstract numbers. Let's just go on to the conclusion. So, and I just extract this from the paper that I read, that I wrote in, for this presentation. The cyborg citizen to which Asad alludes is still to be properly realized. But his aim, of course, is not to focus on the citizen as such, but to make the point that given our current trajectory of thought, we should not expect the various global crises, environmental, political, and economic, and COVID, of course, is, such a huge manifestation of that confronts us to be solved through any post-human future. In his opinion, these crises are generated by the language of abstraction. And things are likely to get worse because post-humanism appears to be nothing but an intensified form of such abstraction. In Asad's opinion, the trajectory of secular progress has insufficiently taken into account the notion of failure. The various global crises are often the unpredictable products of our immersion in a numbered reality. And the various consequently, when they do arise, we do not know how to deal with them. And in fact, our current solutions tend to exacerbate our problems because they're based on the same trajectory. And so where our secular reality may learn from the religious traditions is precisely how to deal with failure, but he's not very optimistic about that happening. The promoters of secularity, science and progress are failing to understand the fatal consequences of how one acts, thinks, and feels in the world. The arrogance in thinking one can act like a god in what classical Greek dramatists saw as the essence of what they call tragedy. With reservation, I think Asad is quite right in highlighting the fact that stumbling into a post-human future without understanding the language used in getting there, including its inability to address the notion of failure, sows the seeds of a rather dystopic state of affairs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Auwais Rafudeen. That was a good presentation, and we heard a kind of interpretation or evaluation of Asad's approach, because he's a very distinguished anthropologist, Muslim anthropologist, and as he elaborated the tension between the embodied language, traditional language, and the abstracted and cultivated, which inaugurated by the modernity. And this tension was elaborated by Mr. Auwais Rafudeen. And here, even though we agreed upon to ask questions at the end, but in order to keep our minds warm now, there is a question from Mrs. Hiba Raouf. She's asked that digitalization is a third level beyond cognitive abstraction and material reality. It is an abstraction that is anti-transcendental. How does this create a tension when religious da'wah is done online? There is also a tendency now to classify historical fatwas and digitalized fatwa process. How do you see that? This is the question of Mrs. Hiba Rauf. What do you say with this regard, Mr. Auwais? Very briefly.
Okay, yeah, sure. Thank you, Professor Hiba. Professor Hiba, are you saying that there is abstraction occurring in religion already? And
no, I'm saying that the nature of abstraction now, that was basically debated between the rational abstraction and the abstraction that leads to a transcendental understanding of the universe. Now we have the digital abstraction that is different in nature and based on basically mathematics and artificial intelligence, etc. So to which extent this can be used to promote transcendental notions? I mean, would there be a tension? And the example that I gave is fatwas. You know, now they are digitalizing fatwas, and some countries said that we have all these banks of fatwas, and it would be easier that you go and ask the question and the robot will answer. You know, it's like they are trying to detach the notion of ilm, the notions of transcendence, the religious notions, and give them to the artificial intelligence as basically data. So how do you see the technology being introduced to this realm, and how would it affect the spirituality and practice of religiosity in our future?
That's an amazing, that's a very important question. I haven't, looked at that particularly, but I do know from the South African experience, we have a bit of a debate about the radio fatwas. And that would fall in the same category, whereby there's a radio mufti and gets sent a whole lot of questions, and he answers, and but he gives these kind of one-off answers all the time, and one answer to a particular question. And I know that some of the shuyukh here were quite unhappy with that particular approach, and were basically saying, well, that's not how fatwa operates. You've got to look entirely at the context of the person who asked the fatwa, the full context, and look at their particular location in life. I think Hussein Agrama has done a brilliant book on the way that happens at Azhar, and then the answer is of course has to be given within the particular context. So just offhand, without having explored that particular question, and I need to kind of explore that, but I mean, I'd be kind of skeptical about that, the way that is going. But I'm not a mufti, or but very far, not even. I think
from the Islamic perspective, the embodiment and the abstraction need to be thought in a technological age, and then in order to explain and even experiment ourselves and think and develop ideas, we need to pick on examples in order to make this trilogy between embodiment, abstraction, and transcendental notions clearer in mind in our everyday life. This is where the question came from, actually. I was trying to use what you said to take an example and test how this would be affecting.
There's also, sorry, I don't want to take the time of the next speaker, but maybe later on we can pursue this. But there's also the actual reality that we're in, where this has become a fundamental part of our reality, where people rely on digital fatwas. And that, of course, there's certain fiqh maxims that come in there. But sorry, thanks. We can maybe explore that a bit later.
Once we arranged a meeting on the listeners asked a question. He said, is it possible to demand or to perform the religious duties from the artificial intelligence if he performs on behalf of us, for example? Is it possible? One of our colleagues spontaneously answered that if you agree for the artificial intelligence go to paradise on behalf of you, okay. Okay, thank you, Mr. Auwais Rafudeen. Now we are going to listen our second speaker, Mr. Safaruk, but he preferred to be called as Saf, yani Saf, pure, from the purity. Chowdhury. Now he's going to present his paper by the title Bay'a to the Machines. How is a Sufi to be within a post-human Tariqa? Here, Mr. Safaruk, I just give briefly his biographic information. Safaruk studied philosophy at King's College, London, completing it with the accompanying Associate of King College Award. He then traveled to Cairo, studying the traditional Islamic studies curricula at Al-Azhar University. He returned to the UK to complete his MA at the School of Oriental and African Studies with distinction. His doctoral dissertation was on the eminent Sufi hagiographer and theoretician Abu Abdurrahman as-Sulami, died in 412 in Hijrah, according to the Hijri date, published as a Sufi apologist of Nishabur, the life and thought of Abu Abdurrahman as-Sulami. His research interests, in addition to Sufism at the moment, are in para-consistent logic, metaphysics, ethics, and epistemology, with keen interest in how these subjects were clarified and explicated within Islamic theological doctrine, especially within Kalam theology. His most recent book is entitled Islamic Theology and the Problem of Evil, which is the first work in Islamic studies to treat the topic within the analytic theology approach. Saf is currently lead research on the project Beyond Foundationalism, New Horizons in Muslim Analytic Theology, funded under a John Templeton Foundation Grant Award in association with Cambridge Muslim College and Aziz Foundation. And here is the stage for Mr. Saf Chowdhury. He's presenting his paper. Here you are.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, everyone. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah. Wa salatu wa salamu ala Rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi man wala. Professor Aybakan, thank you for introducing me. And Professor Hibba, thank you for your correspondence and making everything so smooth. And I thank Ibn Khaldun for inviting me on this wonderful conference. And I'm just so honored to be on this panel. So my topic, I think, is probably an extension of the previous session. So there may be some overlap with the content with the eminent speakers in that session. So I do apologize if there's some repetition or overlap, but hopefully we can benefit from it. What I'll try and do is do a bit of a mixed bag of things. So I'll go through my slides. I may read a little portion of the draft paper, and then inshallah we can open it up to some questions. So what I'm trying to do in this paper is I'm trying to look at two dimensions: posthumanism and transhumanism. I may not have time to see how transhumanism affects what I'm about to talk about, so I do apologize for that, but maybe during the Q&A we can open up the discussion. So it's been very beneficial for me. It's been some great insights and comments that I've been trying to note down and incorporate into this draft essay. So, okay, let me just see. Okay, so now I know this is probably familiar to most of our panelists and maybe even our audience, but just to refresh, what is posthumanism? It's an entangled term, so it's very complex. But in broad strokes, it's a term referring to a number of interrelated issues like ontological, epistemological, methodological developments, especially within the arts, humanities, and social sciences. Now, out of these developments, we have some claims or doctrines or viewpoints or positions, however you want to describe it. Some of them are the following. There's the decentering of what we call the enlightenment subject, i.e. the person being centered, that position from the Enlightenment. Posthumanism wants to derail that centering of the Enlightenment subject. It wants to take issue with the subject being, an exceptional, rational sovereign. Also, the posthumanism wants to reject the fact that the non-human world is merely a stage, you could say, or a forum in which to express, their thoughts and actions. So the world is not a stage for human beings. The posthumanist wants to emphasize a post-anthropocentric ontology. What that basically means is where really there's not a unified stuffness. Rather human beings are fragmentary actors. We have diverse, manifold, our identity is not fixed. It's constituted by many different facets and things. So there is no bounded, overarching material reality, that human beings consist of. So it's very anti-essentialist. The other claim seems to be human beings. If you want to define human beings as persons, human beings or their personhood is constituted by how they relate to other things in the world, not just animals, but technologies, material stuff, text, culture, whatever it might be. So the human person is constituted by a myriad of things. Finally, reality and possibility, according to posthumanism, as I see it anyway, the human logical, conceptual, linguistic, social, cultural categories are not the horizon of what reality and possibility is. So in a nutshell, that's postmodernism. As I said, it probably just echoes what's already been said in the previous session. Now, this is slightly different, although often conflated with transhumanism. So transhumanism, again, these terms are nebulous. As anyone who knows, who's dipping their toe into this field will know the complexity of it. But just in broad strokes, transhumanism, as I've understood it, is obviously shares some assumptions with posthumanism, especially about the nature of human beings. But they do differ in the direction, the focus, and the framing of what issues are, or what priorities are. So posthumanists want to knock humanity off its hubris, knock some sense into it, or move it away from its own deification, you could say, as an all-powerful actor. Transhumanism actually wants to affirm the reality of human power and possibility and potentialities through self-transformation. So it's different from posthumanism. It affirms, in some respect, that kind of anthropocentric dimension. So it differs with posthumanism in that way. Both transhumanism and posthumanism, they do share the assumption that human nature is fluid, porous, it's flexible, and so therefore our identities and what we are and how we define ourselves are fluid. But transhumanism wants to sort of pull away a bit and say science and technology they ought to be used to augment and extend and enhance human goods like freedom, emancipation, autonomy, and things like that. So even to transcend space, terrestrial space. Finally, just to mention something about transhumanism, different from posthumanism, is transhumanism affirms a humanity, science, technology nexus. And so it has an optimism in that nexus. So, but the difference with posthumanism here is that transhumanism don't see don't give any special consideration to the human body as the terminus, i.e. that is the horizon. Rather, transhumanists want to say that our project is not just about how we critically reground human beings as terrestrial agents, but rather how can we enhance our species that to such an extent that we may even transcend our species. Right, so those are just some preliminary points about posthumanism and transhumanism. Now, what's this got to do with Sufism? What's this got to do with Sufis living perhaps within a fraternity, a tariqa, or a community that lives in a zawiya or a khanqa, i.e. how they're living out spirituality as a community. So here I'm just going to read just a portion of my paper, just so I think I can probably better express it. So I'm going to stop sharing this one. I'm going to start sharing the paper. So I do apologize for this short. So hopefully everyone can see that. So, okay, so how is a Sufi supposed to, assuming, let's assume posthumanism and transhumanism, if we're going to adopt the kind of Husserlian epoche, you know, that kind of bracketing our biases and assumptions, let's just assume that it's a coherent approach and take on human nature and reality for the moment. We know there's some huge challenges with this theologically and philosophically. That was intimated in the previous session, which piqued my interest because a lot of what was discussed there, you know, I overlap with my interest. But anyway, let's just assume for now that, you know, posthumanism and transhumanism are viable, coherent takes on the world and human nature. I.e., there are coherent ontology and anthropology. So how could a Sufi, how could this relate to, how could we bring this the paradigm of posthumanism into conversation with sort of Sufi categories and terms? So here's one way. So we know that according to posthumanism and transhumanism, there is a decentering of the self. There is no essential, there's no nature that's essential. So I'll just read this segment and then I'll go on to how a lived expression within a post-human framework can be something a Sufi, or how a Sufi can adopt that. So as already mentioned above in my paper, the defining idea of posthumanism is the deconstruction of the humanist anthropocentrism. The outcome brought about by this deconstruction is to dislocate subjectivity from its hitherto assumed centrality. This enables the subject to be nomadic without an enduring essence that grounds it in some metaphysical constancy. The post-humanist self is not an atomized entity, but a non-unitary relational subject, nomadic and outward bound. Human beings are a materially embedded subject in flux, unfolding, developing, and becoming from an interconnected web of relations and self-organization. There is a parallel to this kind of non-essentialism within Sufi psychology. Of course, I say that with a caveat, which is the illusory nature of the self, the nafs. The common intuition is that we are individuated beings, bound to a reality that defines us in some concrete way. Our memories and experiences are carried out by a distinct substance that constitutes the reflexive I. Some Sufis see this as mistaken. The self is not a fixed substance that is a property bearer. It is merely a reality insofar as it is perceived, attempting to assert itself as real, whereas God alone is the ultimate truth or reality, al-haq. In fact, theological precedents may allow for this kind of deflationary notion of selfhood. Dialectical theologians or mutakallimun in the formative period of Islam were attributed with upholding a view of the individual person as a composite of mere accidents without an underlying substratum to bear them. This selfhood was understood no more than the aggregate of the accidents, a'rad, a person possesses at a given moment in time throughout his or her lifespan. This view was attributed to one of the seminal figures of Sunni orthodoxy, Abu Mansur al-Maturidi, rahimahullah, and there's debate on that, of course. A very similar notion was upheld by the Scottish philosopher David Hume centuries later under the philosophical name bundle theory. For Sufis, in order to reach God, the nafs has to be annihilated to allow for an effacing occurrence in God, or fana, which is essentially loss of the self and any indexicality. The annihilation of the self is attained through a constant struggle known as mujahada, to subjugate it from its inherent assertiveness and recalcitrance. One anecdote mentioned by the renowned Persian mystic and poet Faridun al-Attar in his Ilahi Nama is of the early Sufi Abubakr al-Shibli, recounting how he discovered the elusive veil that was between him and himself was the very self. A man once asked Abubakr al-Shibli, "Who guided you to the path?" He replied, "One day I saw a dog at the edge of a pond on the verge of death due to severe thirst. Every time the dog looked at his reflection in the surface of the clear water, it would think another dog was there. It would not drink the water, frightened of that other dog. It would also refuse to go near the water. Then, when its thirst became unbearable and it could not bear it anymore, the dog suddenly leapt into the water, causing the other dog to vanish. When the reflection of the dog vanished before its eyes, the obstacle to its own self was removed. Similarly," Shibli says, "my own destruction was the clear barrier before me, such that I realized I was my own barrier to myself. So I vanished from myself and overcame my issue. Thus, the first guide for me on my path was a dog." So the anecdote itself is instructional, I think, and illustrative of the post-humanist insistence on interspecies relationality, which will be further developed in the next example, and I'm about to talk about that now. But here, the point is that Shibli erased any sense of the self, as that was the barrier or the hijab between him and himself. Thus, true self-realization meant lifting that veil or overcoming the barrier of one's own illusory self. In this way, destruction of the self allows for a receptivity to vistas of new possibilities for a different emerging person. So perhaps one way then how Sufis can sort of be in a postmodern context is to get rid of that nafs, to get rid of any sense of an essentialist I. The other point, I guess, how a Sufi could be within a post-human context, especially within a tariqa, a fraternity, is to reimagine what a tariqa is and what a community of living within a zawiyah, a khanaqah, what that means. And one model, one framework that's quite helpful, and I think it may have been touched on in one of the sessions, I can't remember, is the actor network theory. So here, actor network theory, ANT, again, is anti-essentialist, it's anti-anthropocentric, it's resistance to entrenched distinctions. According to ANT, things are or become according to what they call the network of relations or assemblages. According to ANT, human agency is not just human actors thinking, reflecting, and doing, that kind of calculated process. That was intimated by Sidi Auwais, but something distributed between a myriad of actors. So whether they're non-human animals, technologies, materials, texts, inscriptions, whatever it might be. So these myriad of actors help mediate and enable agency. So on ANT, the notion of personhood, what it means to be a person or a human being, is constituted or defined by the various networks of relations and assemblages at a particular moment in time. So if you want to use the Sufi phrase of being Ibn al-Waqt, living in the time, well, you be how you are according to your network of relations at that moment in time. So you're living, on the edge, you're living, a splice, you're living on the splice, as it were. So anyway, so what's it got to do with and Zawiya and Khanaqah? What's it got to do with Sufis trying to live out their spiritual expression? Well, perhaps the Tariqa could become this kind of porous and boundless fraternity or system, however you want to categorize it, where there's fluidity and dissipative structures, so there's no hierarchy necessarily. Perhaps this Tariqa can become a creative, interrelated space of possibilities and engagements, and not just binaries, us and them out there beyond our turuq, or even internally between members. Perhaps individual Sufis, as I mentioned just before, can live in the moment. They can live in the waqt, as it were. But at the same time, they're living on the boundary or the splice of biology and machine. So the interface between biology and machine, they're also living at that boundary or interface. Perhaps the Tariqa can be governed by the computational or algorithmic culture. You know, they're using this kind of algorithmic culture to augment and enhance that kind of spiritual wayfaring. So these are just some possibilities. Like I said, this is a purely conjectural paper and exploration. With regard to zawiyas and khanaqah or ribats, maybe the kind of the zawiya as loci or sort of Sufi post-human living, perhaps the adab, the rules that govern these zawiyas, these adab don't constitute a closed and fenced community, but a more sort of conscientious community that sees itself not just constituted by themselves, but they are constituted by, constructed by, and reliant on the whole, i.e. what is beyond their zawiya, their fraternity. So that includes nature, non-human species, the environment, etc. So perhaps together, you know, they live this kind of unified assemblage of human and non-human, collectively engaging, recognizing God, glorifying God, and, you know, remembering Him. So those are just some kind of preliminary, sort of speculative, tentative proposals where how a Sufi might try and live within the assumption of a post-human age or epoch. I haven't talked about the kind of apocalyptic notion of transhumanism and you know, how the kind of the takeover of the algorithm. I haven't really talked about that and how that will affect spirituality, but I'm sure, you know, we can open that on Q&A. So I'll end there, and I really, really thank you all for your time and your patience for listening. I'll just stop the sharing.
Thank you, Mr. Safaruk Chowdhury. This was a very interesting presentation, and of course, everybody who, whoever is going to talk about the posthumanism, it just they are forecasting for the future. None of us knows how the future will unfold. That's why all of the bases are some suppositions, some predictions. And of course here, Mr. Chowdhury, he applied or deployed a kind of simulation through the vocabulary of Sufi to in the future. And this was very illuminating. And now we have a question from the audience, but it comes from Sayyid Mustafa Ali, but he does not mention whom he's asking the question, but both of our speakers can answer the question, and who is relevant the much, and they can prefer to answer. The question is that, in short, as David Theo Goldberg argues, is the modern racial world system a creation of anthropic gods? And he says that, he explains his question, is the secular de-theologization and it is alleged this enchantment, this the Weberian notion, a mask for the continued operation of that which precedes the secular religious binary? In short, is it possible not a shift to the secular, but rather to a re-theologization, albeit one marked by a shift from the transcendent to the purely immanent and global planetary frame, as argued, for example, by Jared Hickman in his essay Globalization and the Gods, Race as Modernity? And this is the question, Mr. Chowdhury, it is directed to you or Mr. Auwais? Whom of you?
I'm not sure. See, the Auwais, do you want to take up that? I mean, there's
both of you can make some contribution. Okay.
Sure, yeah, please, Sidi Saf, go ahead, and then I'll also add my 2 pieces.
it was more of a positing of a thesis, I felt. I mean, obviously there was so much loaded in that question. I definitely think there is some re-theologizing that's going to be taking place for sure. But how that re-theologizing takes place and what categories we're going to use, that is the question. Are we going to re-theologize through kalam? Are we going to re-theologize through, or are we going to re-theologize through the paradigms of, the post-humanist enterprise? So I've got to think about that, because if we're going to theologize through a post-humanist paradigm, some of the, especially from a Muslim perspective, that problematizes certain doctrines, methodological issues, that all that has to be worked out. Obviously, I made the job easy for myself by just bracketing everything out and saying, let's assume post-humanism and transhumanism is coherent and valid, and therefore I'm trying to explore some conjectures with Sufism. But it's not as easy as that. So I'm working out myself. I'm trying to rework theology through these categories, especially in matters of theodicy, so soteriology, meaning making, which I think was mentioned in the previous session. So I'm trying to look at that ethical dimension as well. So I need to concretize some of my thoughts. But what Sayyid Mustafa Ali mentioned there is very, very deep and important. I've got to concretize some of my thoughts on that. So apologies for not being more constructive.
Sorry, yeah. So perhaps just my 2 pence on here as well. I thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, we're talking here, of course, more broadly about the decolonial debate, and I've been thinking a lot about it, and I am worried about the problem of inscription. As indicated, I think yourself, Dr. Ali, and as City Staff just indicated now as well, we want to come up with our own solutions. I do worry that, for example, the focus on I mean, of course, the history needs to be thoroughly taken into account. But I am worried, for example, even in Fanon, and if you look at her work like Black Skins, White Mask, there is a deep inscription into the existentialism of Sartre, for example. And I worry that that when we re-theologize, sorry, I hope I'm understanding your question correctly also. I mean, I do call for as well, a re-look at theology, but I am a bit worried, about present trends in decolonialism that basically are inscribed within sometimes the very paradigms they critique. And I think we've got to be very careful in that, in moving, moving forward. Myself, my disagreement with Asad itself is with him is maybe, also linked to the fact that we can't be too pessimistic about the present moment, about being, we need to be Ibn al-Waqt and take cognizance of the very moment. Big questions about time here that also go on in the background, the nature of time. But in any case, maybe we can pursue that discussion again. Sorry, I've probably left you nowhere with this answer, but that's where I'll leave it there for now.
May I ask a question? Is it possible for the humanity to find or to arrive to discover the algorithm of the creation? Mr. Chowdhury, what do you think?
Wow. Well, I mean, that has an assumption about whether behind reality there is an algorithm. So that takes us into metaphysics. But Probably not. There's so many angles from which to look at this. I mean, you know, but yeah, if is there an underlying it's similar to the argument from philosophy of mathematics, where we say whether reality is undergirdled by, if we were to peel away reality, do we have numbers floating around in reality? You know, so I don't know. Probably not. I think you know, the algorithm of creation, it's a divine fiat. So you know, if you want to explain the divine act through material categories, I don't think that's possible. If we're taking creation to be a divine fiat, an act of the divine, if it's creatio ex nihilo, probably not. If it's la min shay, if it's khalq la min shay, then yeah, I mean, there's nothing there.
Okay, I think there is a physician. He says that oh God, I don't want to discover the details, but just I want to discover the rules that you created this universe.
That is the question. We all want to know the recipe. We all want to know the recipe, you know, and the ingredients of the recipe.
Okay, there is from our audience, there is a question from Mahmoud Ghani. It is for you, Mr. Safi. Salams, Jazakallah khairan for the talk. And are global frameworks which seek to offer a transcendental account, conditions of possibility for phenomena, including Sufism. How do you see Sufism as a resisting and disrupting such accounts, if at all?
I've not, in my paper, I don't really explore tasawwuf as a disruptive force. I kind of position tasawwuf a kind of acquiescing, you know, sort of being within post-humanism. So, but it certainly can be, for sure. How that will quite look like, I haven't quite really thought that out. So as I said, I've positioned Sufism more as a kind of accepting the given of post-humanism. So therefore it's trying to arrange itself and configure itself within that paradigm, rather than maybe even to liberate itself from that paradigm. Not that it cannot do that, of course it can. I haven't looked at immediately tasawwuf being that kind of disruptive force. I think it ought to be. I think it's always been like that. It's always been fuduli, yeah, you could say. It's always been a nuisance for many. And so I don't see why in this particular moment in time, it also cannot be just as radical and, you know, and getting its elbows stuck in. I have to again think again, you know, I have to, you know, state my ignorance on this. I haven't thought out the radical elements here, the radical elements here of tasawwuf. So I need to think about that.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Hiba Rauf, she wants to make a comment. Please.
I want to comment on Saf when he was saying the whole idea is very interesting. Number one, I want to challenge the definitions, because there are different notions of nafs from an Islamic perspective. So when you're saying you want to kill yourself in order to find yourself, you're talking about the ego. But you're not talking about an-nafsul lawama, you're not talking about an-nafsul zakiyya, you're not talking, etc., because the nafs has different aspects. So you should be careful. Also, when you're talking about Ibn Zamanihi, it's like the anchor. You have to be anchored. You can't just float around. You have to be anchored in your time, because it's very peculiar and very specific. But at the same time, you are also the son of the Azal. You are also the son of the oath that you gave before you were born, and you are the son of and you are the inheritor of the Risala, which is transcendental and wahi, and you are heading to the Abad. So it's like, what do you mean by Ibn Zamanihi? As if sometimes it cuts us off because you have to be here and now, the power of now, as they call it. And one has to be very careful because all these definitions are different, completely different in the modernist definition from the Islamic definition. And the overlap in the lafz, in the notion, in the word, does not mean that we mean the same thing. And this is a very tricky issue. This is why actually when you are doing your Sufi search, you have to be also very embedded in usulul fiqh, because it tells you about al-furuq. You know, this Qarafi's theory about al-furuq, you know, it's the very precious book. Another thing that I think that this is not when you say that the Sufi has always been part of the cosmos and part of the creation and in relation to all different, not even in Islam, we don't have even relation to animals, we have relations to material things like al-jibal. يعني يا جبال أوبي معه والطير وألنا له الحديد. I mean, this is a very interesting verse in the Quran because it shows that even mountains make tasbih. So you are in a world, in a cosmos, where actually you relate to different types of creations that are practicing their own type of worship that you don't understand, you know, don't know the language. And mountains also are mountains are very interesting in the Quran, by the way, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِنَّا عَرَضْنَا الْأَمَانَةَ عَلَى السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَالْجِبَالِ فَأَبَيْنَ أَنْ يَحْمِلْنَهَا. So how could what we have taken as amana could have been carried by mountains in the first place? You know, it's like, so there is a secret in the mountains, and during the time of revelation, Prophet Muhammad was in the mountain. You know, it's like there is something in the mountain that we don't understand. So if you want to do that from a perspective of Islam, it's completely different from the notion of assemblage and the notion of opening up to all types. That is very slippery. You know, it's like you have to be very careful and say, okay, we also share with you this and that. No, but we are so much different in the essential perspective and essential perception of the khalq. And regarding the question of Professor Bilal, when he posed this very difficult question, the algorithm of creation, I think part of that is embedded in a notion that has been a lot of time neglected. And I didn't find too many literature, too many books about that. The notion of nizamul alam, the notion that all of that comes into a system. And that system is وَإِنَّا لَمُوسِعُونَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala described al-samawati wal-ard, and he said, and we will expand. So there isn't a continuous change even in the khalq. It didn't just take place and that's it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is present, and he's al-khallaq. The lafz al-khallaq in Arabic means that the continuation and the ability, etc. So I think maybe the notion of sibgha might be the word that we should look into, because we usually focus on fitra, which is related to nafs. But as-sibgha, it has taken my attention in the Quran, and I think as-sibgha means basically nizam al-alam, nizam al-khalq. And I doubt that we will be able to discover. We keep trying to discover a bit. وَمَا أُوتِيتُم مِنَ الْعِلْمِ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Hiba. This was a valuable contribution to this speech. And we have only 4 minutes. Mr. Chowdhury, would you like to make any? Would you like to say anything on what Mrs. Hiba said?
No, I think Professor Hiba has highlighted. In my paper, I mentioned the methodological doctrinal challenges, you know, to classical Sunni theology by taking this route. And some of it, alhamdulillah, you know, my thoughts align with Professor Hiba's, and I'm happy about that. You're definitely right. We don't want to be one-dimensional in our co-opting terms just so we can try and get some kind of speculative merit. But yeah, obviously, as I mentioned as a caveat at the beginning, this was purely on the assumption that posthumanism is a coherent assumption, that it's a coherent outlook on human anthropology, ontology, you know, and specific methodologies as well. Whether it is in fact the case that itself is you know, that itself we have to critique, I think, and address from the Islamic theological perspective. So I think definitely I take that on board. An exercise in speculation unearth these kind of flat or one-dimensional sort of accounts. So I really appreciate Professor Hibber's immense knowledge and insight on that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. We have 2 minutes, but I would like to ask a brief question to Mr. Auwais Rafudeen about to what extent especially the thoughts of Talal Asad are infected by his adventurous life, because he comes from an Asturian father and a Shammari tribe mother, and later on they goes to Pakistan, and the couple divorce, and he goes to England, and that's why we find this a kind of binary in his nature, or combating with each other, as I say. What is the effect of this personal life on his thought? What do you think about that?
Yeah, in fact, I mentioned the mother, Professor Bilal, precisely because of that reason. He was very close to his mother. He likes to recount that well-known anecdote about the old women of Nishapur. And he said, I think Imam Ghazali also speaks about it. We all wish we had the faith, the iman of the old women of Nishapur. And I think his mother was that influence in his life.
Yeah.
She wasn't an intellectual. She was, as I said, from a Bedouin tribe. She used to know Arabic poetry, which she used to recite to him, and so on. But from what I understand, she wasn't like literal, and he says she wasn't an intellectual in her father's, manner or anything like that. But he was profoundly influenced by her life. The fact that she kind of was so absorbed in her religion in a natural way. He wanted to get at as to, why was she so absorbed in, without needing, like, in a sense of needing to think about the religion. Why was she so absorbed in it? And, that basically drives his reflections on embodiment. And so I think, and in his latest article, where he talks a bit about his biography, he does have a section on his mother. The longest section that I've seen on his mother and the influence she played on his life. So I think, although he kind of repatched his relations with his father later on in his life, of course, after the divorce, I think there was maybe, or in any case, for a while. But be that as it may, definitely his mother was the prominent influence in his life. And I find that quite fascinating, because I think, our grannies tend to influence us in ways we don't know. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. It seems to me that he tries to compromise between a loving heart of mother with the reasoning mind of father during his...
Yes, absolutely. Yes, sorry, just very quickly, the other aspect, of course, I mean, the mother provided him solutions on that, but the other side was Wittgenstein, was his sheikh in the secular world, and he drew a lot from Wittgenstein, and of course, later on his father as well.
Thank you very much. Thank to all of the audience and who are attended this session. It was very fruitful, and thank you for everybody for who asked questions and made contributions. I hope our time is off now, and I think we are going to leave this the stage. And Mrs. Hiba Rauf, would you like to say anything? We are going to end this session. Okay. Thank you to everybody. Thank you. Inshallah, see you in other occasion.
The following session starts at 5, inshallah.
Inshallah. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. آخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين.